more of those officers onto the street. Frankly, it wasn't good enough that there were only 3,000 deployed when this started, and it shows how much you can do, getting up to 16,000 deployed with help from outside. And as I said, those numbers will be available at all times in the future, even with the reductions we're making in budgets.
Today marks the start of a long, sober and difficult post-mortem as to why parts of our society chose to rob the very communities that they were part of. The Prime Minister implied that we must start by looking at the powers given to the police. Could I ask him to assure the House that if the police choose to use water cannon, they can do so without influence by ministers, and if necessary, they are also allowed to close down mobile phone rebroadcasts, as was done after the 7/7 bombings, to make sure that we isolate the use of Twitter and Facebook, which allowed the mobs to be one step ahead of the police.
The point I'd make to the Honourable Gentleman is, of course, conversations have to take place between the Home Office and the police about the use of different technologies or different tactics. But the point the Home Secretary and I have been making in recent days is they should feel free to examine whether they need these capabilities in the knowledge they're going to have political support for doing what's necessary to keep our streets safe.
Barbara Keeley.
The Prime Minister keeps referring to 16,000 police officers in London. We only had 16,000 police officers because they came down in busloads from places like Salford, leaving the Greater Manchester Police totally overstretched and not able to face down a violent crowd of 1,000 individuals. We've already lost more than 300 police officers. There is no case for any more cuts.
I don't think the Honourable Lady is being fair on ACPO and the PNIC system that actually makes sure that police officers are sent to the areas where they're needed. And in the case of Greater Manchester, they themselves were getting mutual aid from other parts of the country.
Any Mordaunt?
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister spoke of the significant number of young people that we have who have no moral compass and no sense of community. On Monday, I visited one of the pilot sites of the National Citizenship Programme and was very impressed with what I saw. Can I ask when those pilots are audited and reviewed and recommendations made for the programme proper, that the recent events the last few days are taken into account?
I think the Honourable Lady makes an excellent point. I feel passionately that National Citizen Service is a great idea for young people in our country. We want to make it available to as many young people as we can. We're piloting 30,000 places in the coming months. I'm looking forward to visiting some of them myself, and I think they'll help demonstrate what the Honourable Member opposite spoke about, which is how many positive role models there are amongst our young people.
Mr. Angus Robertson. Speaker, hundreds of specialist police officers have been deployed from Scotland's 8 forces in support of colleagues in England, and it's right and proper that everything is provided to assist areas that have been struck by the rioting and disorder. Could the Prime Minister confirm what conversations he or the Home Secretary have had directly with the Scottish Government about this support?
I'm not aware of any conversations, but what I am aware of is the excellent role that Scottish police officers played, particularly helping the West Midlands force, and I saw for myself the impact they had when they arrived in Birmingham, and I think it's very good that our forces can cooperate in this way.
Mr. Andrew Salu.
Prime Minister paid tribute to those police forces from outside London, such as Bedfordshire Police, who did send considerable numbers of officers to London, whose remaining officers have had to work greatly extended shifts, and who have been magnificently supported by large numbers of special constables to keep policing going in Bedfordshire.
I will certainly do that. I mean, I support having local police forces. I was never in favour of these large police mergers, and I think the last 72 hours have demonstrated how you can have a system where you get the police officers you need in the places that you need.
Catherine McKinnell.
Mr. Speaker, the police, courts and CPS must be commended for their work around the clock to deliver swift arrests and charging decisions, but there's much more to do, not least to ensure that successful prosecutions are now delivered. And given the unprecedented nature of these events and the strain that the justice system is already under due to budget cuts, will the Prime Minister commit today to making additional resources available to ensure that justice can be delivered for victims?
What I can say to the Honourable Lady is that at Cobra there was not only a Justice Minister but also the Attorney General making sure that where there were any problems that a police force was reporting with the local Crown Prosecution Service, we could work very quickly to make sure resources were put in place. I think we should continue that in the coming days, perhaps mostly at an official level, to make sure these bottlenecks are dealt with.
Mr. James Clapperson.
Can I warmly welcome what my right honourable friend has said about robust sentencing? And whilst speedy justice is important, it shouldn't be at the expense of unacceptable compromises. Surely all those who organise riots through misuse of the social media, attack police, throw missiles or commit arson should face very long sentences of imprisonment.
Yep, I agree with the honourable gentleman. It has to be for the courts to set these sentences, but they have tough sentences available, and I'm sure they'll use them.
Jerry Sutcliffe.
These indeed are difficult times, and the safety of our communities are important. But the Prime Minister talked about the Olympics and the international damage done to our reputation. It was right that the England International was cancelled on Wednesday, but is it going to be right that the Premier League or the Football League and the sporting fixtures may be cancelled this week? What's the Prime Minister's view on that?
Well, this was discussed at COBRA this morning. As I understand it, subsequent, it's been decided that the Tottenham game against Everton should be postponed. But as I understand it, the intention is that other games in London at the start of the Premier League season should go ahead, but perhaps starting earlier in the day. I think that sounds like a very sensible agreement, if that indeed is what has been agreed between the Premier League and the police.
Charlotte Leslie.
I thank the Prime Minister and very much welcome the tangible provisions he's put in place in case 750's rights should ever happen again. But the fact that there's been no consequence to actions and criminal actions has been a problem that the communities out there have been screaming about for years. From a low level to antisocial behaviour, excrement put through litter bins, talk to people in Henbury in my constituency. Whilst I very much welcome the provisions for emergency situations, can the Prime Minister reassure me that the fact that criminal actions and antisocial actions will have consequences will seep right down to the start of this problem in our local communities?
I think the Honourable Lady speaks very powerfully about this. I think this would be a wake-up call to the police in terms of the way they work with communities and make them even more determined that actually even low-level disorder and violence must be punished and punished quickly. And I think there's an we must look for good things to come out of this, and one good thing that should come out of this is for the police to connect themselves even more deeply to those communities, some of whom do feel let down.
Mr. Robert Flello. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to all the public sector workers who we rely upon time and time again. But, Mr. Speaker, and in particular, of course, those in Staffordshire, but, Mr. Speaker, over many months I have had letters from serving police officers concerned about the Windsor report and the knock-on effect on morale, concerned about issues of A19 and losing senior officers, and now concerned about the fact that having been called upon at our time of need, out there on the streets, putting themselves in the firing line literally sometimes, they are having leave cancelled and they're having to give up holidays and overtime requirements. But, Mr. Speaker, we took an hour and a half to hear the words HMIC, and we've heard nothing about Mayor Boris Johnson's view on policing cuts. Will the Prime Minister now finally get to his feet and address the 16,000 loss?
I don't know whether we need an inquiry into safety in the House, Mr. Speaker, but someone seems to have stolen his jacket. But I'd say, of course we are asking, I accept, we are asking police officers to do a difficult job, and yes, we are asking them to undergo a pay freeze as other public sector workers are, but we are giving them the backing they want by cutting the paperwork and enabling them to get out on the street and do the job they want.
I'm grateful for the Prime Minister's concern, but I can assure the House that nothing disorderly has happened. The Honourable Gentleman was perfectly in order. He was focusing not on sartorial matters but on violence, and he was perfectly in order, and we'll leave it at that. And I do ask the House to try to rise to the level of events. Mr. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, and particularly the support that he is offering to small and medium-sized businesses. As someone whose business has been directly affected by this, although not disastrously, I have to admit, I know the disruption this is causing. Will the Prime Minister assure me that no business will be lost and no livelihood subsequently lost because of the actions of these thugs and hooligans, and that the £20 million support fund, if deemed not big enough, will be increased to make sure that those actions don't happen?
Yeah. Well, of course, we'll keep this issue under review, but let me make the point, there's obviously the Riot Damages Act, as well as the £20 million scheme. I believe that should be enough, but I know my right honourable friend, the member for Hertford and Stortford, will be on the case.
Caroline Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, violence is always to be condemned, but as the Prime Minister has said, seeking to understand violence is a world away from seeking to justify it, and indeed we ought to try to understand it to stop it happening in future. Given the growing evidence from Scarman onwards that increasing inequality has a role to play in drawing in at least some people into violent behaviour, could the Prime Minister reassure the House that comprehensive impact assessments will be undertaken before his government introduces any more policies that increase and further inequality?
Well, of course, everyone wants to see a fairer and more equal country, but I have to say to the Honourable Lady, young people smashing down windows and stealing televisions is not about inequality.
Matthew Hancock. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating policemen from Suffolk and across East Anglia who came to London to support? But will he also answer this question? My constituents were shocked to discover that only 3,000 of the 32,000 policemen in the Met were on duty. What are we going to do to change that, and can we get cross-party support for it?
Well, first of all, I certainly join him in praising Suffolk and other police forces in East Anglia and in Essex, of course, as well, who got police officers into our capital. The point I made about the deployment of officers is, I think, one of the lessons that we have to learn about the ability to surge up quickly the numbers when the circumstances require it.
Dan Biles.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree that no matter how good a job the police do in arresting these people, too many of these thugs simply don't care if they're caught or not because they have no respect for or fear of the criminal justice system? And until we can resolve that, we will not be able to resolve the wider problem.
I think the Honourable Gentleman makes a good point. There will be people who will be arrested this time, who casually entered a broken-down shop and nicked things, thinking somehow that was okay, who are going to get an almighty shock when they get a criminal record and potentially go to jail, and quite right too. But he's right to say there's a hardcore who aren't frightened enough of the criminal justice system, and we need to make sure they are.
Mr. Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also thank the Prime Minister for his telephone call, actually up to me, but on behalf of the overwhelming majority of my constituents who were appalled by this organised criminality that trashed the centre of Manchester. But can I ask the Prime Minister, if he will look at this, there really does have to be a review, and he's committed to this, of the tactics of policing. That may reveal that because police officers in Greater Manchester were working 12-hour shifts on the night Manchester was trashed, there must be a real question about the numbers that were available. Now, within that context, can the Prime Minister at least commit to the House that he will review the situation to make sure that numbers can never be an issue in not having the blue uniformed police on duty at the time we need them?
Of course we'll look at all these issues, and ACPO and the Home Office and others will want to learn all the lessons. The point I'd just simply make to the Honourable Gentleman is because on Tuesday it was possible in Manchester, in London, in Wolverhampton, elsewhere, to surge the numbers up more rapidly. It would have been possible on Monday. Now, this is not to criticise the police. You can't get everything right when you're dealing with these very difficult situations. But I think it's the surge capacity we've got to look at, rather than pretending this is all about the resources in 2, 3, 4 years' time.
Mr. David Burrows.
Constituents will commend the Prime Minister's statements and also the sentiments of the Leader of the Opposition, which are in marked contrast to the former London Mayor, whose shameful comments seeking to justify the riots who wreaked havoc in places like Enfield should be condemned by all the House. But as we provide unqualified support to our police, is it not just the case, it's not just about resources, but to empower our police? It may be so they can get their hands on water cannon or rubber bullets, but also to free them up, free their hands up from the time it takes to process individual arrests, and to free them up from this risk-averse culture which is tying their hands.
As my honourable friend used to work as a solicitor, he knows this well. There's been far too much time taken up in paperwork after an arrest is made, and we need to cut down that paperwork. I already think the joint working between police and CPS is helping with that. Virtual courts are helping with that, and also the 24-hour courts that have been working around the clock have made a big difference too.
Jim Sheridan.
Mr. Speaker, the vast majority of the people in Scotland share the anger and frustration of the victims of these crimes, but they're equally disappointed at the statement of the First Minister that this was an English problem. I have to say that people are extremely disappointed in it, but I welcome the statement by the Prime Minister that he'll be seeking advice from Strathclyde Police. Can I therefore ask him to extend into the judicial system in Scotland, who took seriously the concerns of the police and the community and imposed the appropriate sentences?